we're on to our final session today. Focuses on community engagement and environmental justice. It'll be moderated by our community engagement manager, Desiree Blanchard. One of the reasons we left this session for last is because it's really what the entire day is about. It's how do we reach out so that all of the work that we do, all of the projects that we put together are inclusive in their planning and inclusive in their execution. This is just the most important thing for us to focus on as we go forward over the next few years. You know, we run several programs for a variety of agencies of the federal government, and we work in close partnership with the Connecticut DOT. We not only have an obligation under these programs to conduct public involvement, community engagement, review environmental justice issues, we believe that we need to make a real effort to talk directly to people in neighborhoods. So we've really recommitted ourselves as an agency to doing direct outreach, to getting into the communities, and to talking about these plans that, you know, we put them together, we publish them. You know, I hate to say that anything goes on a shelf or it just ends up on the website. We really want people to talk about it and understand what it means for their communities. So I think this session is going to answer those questions. We're going to look at environmental justice. We're going to talk about President Biden's Justice 40 initiative, what that means for development as we go forward, and all those investments that we are about to make. So please help me to welcome one of the key people in organizing the entire day, NVCOG Community Engagement Manager, Desiree Blanchard.
Thank you, Rick. Hopefully you guys can hear me. I'm a little shorter than the gentleman who presented earlier. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming out, and I hope that you have been enjoying the conference thus far. Again, my name is Desiree Blanchard, and I work as the Community Engagement Manager for NVCOG. In my role, I am responsible for collaborating with our planners to promote our organization and projects and services, and to engage various audiences in our work. By show of hands, and let's all be honest here at the end of the day, how many of you before today were familiar with us as a Council of Governments and really familiar with the work that we did? Okay, all right, seeing a few hands, not a lot of hands going up. Many members of our communities, like some of you, are unfamiliar with us and the work that we do. Traditionally, agencies have had public involvement requirements, but a lot of what we do has been data-driven, and you kind of heard that a little bit earlier in the transportation panel, leading to projects on the back end that aren't so reflective of those who live on the front end. It is our communities that end up living with the results of our decisions, like David Morgan said earlier, and I love getting the little nuggets and things to take away, and so David said, you know, nothing about us without us is for us, and I truly do believe that. So how do we better connect with people to create equitable spaces? And that's really going to lay the foundation for today's presentation and conversation. So I'll ask you once more to participate, because it's not truly engaging if it's not participatory. So consider the following question. Which of the following is the most potent predictor of an individual's health? By show of hands, how many would say A, it's race? How many would say B, zip code? How many would say C, income? And how many would say D, education level? All right. So according to Dr. Robert Bullard, Distinguished Professor of Urban Planning and Environmental Policy, today's zip code is still the most potent predictor of an individual's health and well-being. And why is this? This is largely due to conditions that exist within that zip code. Zip code is a more subtle indicator for socioeconomic factors and social determinants that are inherent to health and longevity. So let's talk about environmental justice. Environmental justice is based on this very same notion, right? That individuals who physically live, work, and play in the wrong neighborhoods are subjected to elevated environmental health threats and more than their fair share of preventable diseases. The federal definition of environmental justice is, pause for a long gasp, the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with the respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Now that's quite a mouthful for us all to remember, but what I want you to remember is two things. One, environmental justice is about ensuring that no one faces disproportionate consequences of environmental pollution or is denied access to environmental benefits. And two, it's about ensuring that people have access to the decisions that impact their lives. And as you can see here on the slide, EJ concerns are very vast. They look different in all of our communities. So don't think this is a one-size-fits-all model or that you can't be a part of the solution. EJ is a real problem. Historically, racial minorities and low-income populations have borne the brunt of environmental issues. But let me share with you a statistic to put that into perspective and bring that to today. According to a 2020 report from the Connecticut Health Foundation, compared to their white peers, Black children and teens are nearly 5.5 times more likely to go to the emergency room because of asthma, whereas Hispanic children and teens are 4.5 times as likely to go to the emergency room because of asthma. It's encouraging to see the increased focus on and discussion surrounding EJ and underserved communities. You know, earlier they talked about how this is becoming more of a conversation, how there's more of an emphasis on this. With Executive Order 14008, President Biden established the government-wide Justice 40 Initiative, which is a whole-of-government effort to ensure that federal agencies work with states and local communities to deliver at least 40% of overall benefits from federal investments to disadvantaged communities. In the past, it may have been possible to overlook these concerns, but now we're seeing an emphasis in federal grant applications where we're being asked to track the benefits and how they're flowing to which communities, and we are required to engage in stakeholder consultation to ensure that community stakeholders are meaningfully involved in the benefits and determining what benefits are of programs. So, how do we achieve justice? One of the guiding principles of environmental justice and the lengthy definition provided by the Environmental Protection Agency that I cited for you earlier is to ensure the full and fair participation by all potentially affected communities in the decision-making process. The populations that have historically been saddled with environmental burdens and left out of environmental benefits must be central to decision-making as solutions are deployed. Our work can only be reflective of the needs and desires of the community by moving beyond general outreach, where we see communication flowing in one direction, to more clear and stronger community involvement. So what does this look like at NVCOG? We're working to incorporate environmental justice and non-discrimination principles into our planning and decision-making processes. And this, identifying communities is an integral part of this. We recently developed demographic profiles, pulling data from the American Community Survey to identify minority, low income, environmental justice, and other underserved communities in the region. And all of this information can be found in our Title VI plan, which is on the publications table. The map on your right looks at poverty data. Darker shaded areas represent those tracts with a higher percentage of population in poverty. We were able to look at this and figure out that 17.7% of the region's population has been determined to live in poverty. The map on your left identifies minority populations. The darker shaded areas represent tracts with a higher concentration of minority individuals. And again, we were able to understand that 30.3% of the region is minority, including a 16.9% Hispanic population. This data allows us to determine which communities exist and where they exist for the sake of ensuring the full and fair participation of all potentially affected communities in our processes. We created the following map of environmental justice communities that exceed the regional thresholds for low income and minority. So you'll see red census block groups that have both qualifying factors, and you'll see blue census block groups if they have one of the factors. With this data, we're able to examine the benefits to or adverse effects of our plans and projects on these communities. We are able to ensure that we're equitably channeling investment benefits towards underserved and marginalized communities, and more so, using EJ assessments and these type of analyses, we're able to use it as a process to support and inform our collaborative decision-making processes when we're reaching out to people and getting that feedback. We've also been, and I'm very excited, tailoring our strategies to promote and be more inclusive when we do public participation. And what this looks like is that we will consult with community leaders and organizations. You heard David Morgan speaking earlier about the relationship that we've been building and talking to him, and that's the same for many other organizations. We will engage identified populations. We will host our meetings in targeted and accessible locations. We will attend community events to educate and interact with the residents, because there's no way to get to know people than to be before them. And I'm very happy to say that recently we were able to attend Waterbury's Harry Potter Day, and it was such a magical event, if I do say so myself, pun intended. And finally, we will utilize language translation services. So we're looking at translating our programs, our plans, our summary sheets, things like that, so that we can reach targeted and limited English proficient individuals. And so with that, I will leave you with a prime example of achievable environmental justice and community-driven planning right here in our region. We at NVCOG are also involved on a technical assistance level. So 99 Bank Street in Waterbury is a former brownfields site that's located in a disadvantaged community. Reflecting on the data, you'll be able to see that this community is 62% minority. The EJ screening tool will tell you that this community is within the 95th percentile for traffic proximity and the 93rd percentile for hazardous waste proximity. It was 2 community residents and leaders that approached Mayor O'Leary in the city of Waterbury, who advocated for much needed recreational space for the children of that community. With that, we were able to assist by providing an environmental site assessment on the property. And with this data, city leaders were able to propose a redevelopment plan in which we at the NVCOG were able to provide cleanup funding. Today, the site is now the home of a beautiful park in this area with all the amenities that a child could hope for. You know, a basketball court, a slide, a playground, all the works. It is through collaborating and listening to our communities that we are truly able to achieve the equitable spaces that our communities so rightly deserve and so rightly desire. And with that, I will now introduce our panelists to help us continue our discussion on environmental justice, community involvement, and capacity building. So with us, we have Brent Peterkin. Brent is the first full-time executive director of Gather New Haven. Gather New Haven is an urban agriculture and environmental organization in New Haven with a mission to promote health, equity, and justice for people and the environment. Previously, Brent was also a Zoom Policy Fellow in the Office of the Governor, working in support of the Office of Early Childhood, focusing on parent engagement and fatherhood development. Brent also worked with a Yale University-based global anti-poverty initiative and supported at-risk high school students in Yonkers, New York. We have Charlotte Gray, MPH. Charlotte has worked with the United States Environmental Protection Agency for over 3 years as a community involvement coordinator. Charlotte's role with the agency is to serve as a liaison between community members and the agency officials and help take the technical work that the EPA does and make it accessible to the public. Charlotte receives a master's in public health with certificates in environmental health and epidemiology and biostatistics from Boston University. And last but certainly not least, we have Jason Velasquez. Jason is a Master's of Environmental Science candidate at Yale School of the Environment, where he's a graduate research fellow in Justice, Equity, and Diversity and Sustainability Initiative. In his role, he assists with data collection and analysis on food access throughout Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Michigan. His academic research is on aligning Connecticut's Puerto Rican serving community-based organizations with organizations in Puerto Rico through resource acquisition and distribution to better support climate change response. Jason currently also serves on the board of directors for the Keeney Park Sustainability Project in Windsor, Connecticut. So, round of applause, welcome to our panelists. Join you over here. Hope that I don't have a memorable moment like Rick. So to get started with the first question, I would like to pose this to Brent to start us off. You've had experience as a social impact leader, working to build accountable, collaborative, and trusting relationships with urban communities. So what would you say are some ways that we can increase levels of community involvement, trust, and communication to better plan for and create places that are healthy and vibrant for all?
Sure, thank you. Hello, everyone. I would say, anecdotally, the environmental justice, the outdoor enthusiast, the naturalist community in New Haven consists of predominantly white senior-aged people. And I don't say that as a critique per se, but I say that as a way of stating that we need to be explicit and that we need to diversify that community. And the question we must ask ourselves is one in which how we will pursue succession planning. So the city of New Haven is about 2/3 Hispanic Latinx, Black African American. So if we are not engaging with the entirety of the communities and cities of New Haven, then we're doing ourselves a disservice when it comes to tackling environmental justice issues. So my organization, Gather New Haven, it's very visible. Most of our work occurs outdoors. And so by virtue of that reality, we're accessible to the communities. Our staff reflects the neighborhoods of New Haven. Our farm manager grew up in New Haven. He is someone who people can ask questions. They can learn how to grow their own food. They know their farmer. They know that he's committed to their community. But truly, it starts with public engagement. It means that you must beat the streets, essentially. So you have to get out in the highways and the byways, have conversations. If there's a stakeholder engagement event, you cannot merely rely on social media or listservs to publicize your event because you're speaking to a connected and highly conscientious audience already. And so if you want meaningful change and engagement, you have to go into the neighborhoods, walk the neighborhoods, strike up conversations, spend the time to educate and inform the community members. But also I would add that we have to look at the institutions within our community, specifically our public schools. So it starts with having an environmental justice curriculum, engaging young people at an early age, and cultivating their social and academic memory and understanding of environmental justice issues in their neighborhood, and then combining that with scientific literacy so that they understand the challenges, but also are thinking creatively and are in position to ideate on the solutions as they transition throughout their formative years and enter into adulthood. And this leads us to environmental citizenship. So I would say, utilize public spaces, whether it be community gardens, whether it be green spaces like parks or nature preserves. Our city is unique in that we do have nature preserves that my organization manages in the city of New Haven. We have dozens of community gardens. We use these spaces to connect with residents throughout the neighborhood, but I would also leverage public libraries, public schools, but lastly and most importantly, you have to have sort of like a guerrilla marketing campaign. Your community and outreach engagement activities and endeavors have to be immersive and drive you right into the community. Just the other day, I was in the Fairhaven neighborhood of New Haven, walking Grand Avenue, the entirety of it pretty much, and just connecting with people, promoting the festival that we're having. It's the Gather New Haven Festival, celebrating health, wellness, and connections with nature. And, you know, people were interested, people were excited, and what I found that people were appreciative that someone was willing to walk the streets and have a conversation with them and engage with them and to learn from their perspectives. And I think that makes people feel valued and wants them to develop a sense of curiosity, but also a sense of ownership when it comes to environmental justice advocacy and engagement.
Great, yeah, definitely. Jason, want to give you time to respond as well, but quickly would like to follow up with Charlotte. You know, when you first took on your role at EPA, what were some of the areas that you saw were most in need?
Yeah, so I'm a community involvement coordinator with the US EPA, and I don't just work in Connecticut, I work across all of New England, so the 6 states. And when I was brought on, the need that I saw that I could fill the most was taking the technical information that we were producing and making it understandable to the average person. We produce a lot of documents that are pretty high level, 500 pages. Who wants to read that, you know? They'd rather, there are people that do, but most people want a fact sheet that's easy to understand and it gets to the point. So I think that the need that I was able to fill was condensing that material and making it into a way that's easy to understand. But not only having that material, but making sure that it's accessible. So whether that's getting it translated or making sure that it's not just on the web and I'm not just emailing it out, but maybe dropping it off at a local library, bringing it to the town hall for it to be mailed out. So there's a lot of different ways that you can work to make something accessible. And as Brent said, it's about being on the ground and listening to the community and what they have to say and the best way to engage with them.
Definitely. Floor is yours, Jason.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I think it's one of the ways that we approach this is by making sure that we all have empathy when we're doing this work. You know, if we're just going into communities and that we're not necessarily familiar with and attempting to engage and solve solutions without really understanding who are among those communities, I think it can be detrimental in our planning processes. So I completely agree with my two panelists here of getting out there in the community and being able to get to know these faces, go to those events. I think one of my least favorite sort of quotes is like, oh, who are the voices that are not present at the table? When really the question is, we have to be asking, why have these voices been excluded from the table in the first place? What are the accessibility barriers to getting to that level of decision-making processes as well? And also another big piece of that is compensation for people's time. If you're expecting people to come to your events, if you're expecting people to take time out of their busy day, especially if I'm working third shift because I have to make ends meet and now you want me to show up at a time when I got to go pick up my kids and also get dinner, you know, you kind of got to meet people where they're at, and you got to be able to compensate them for their time, whether that's meals, whether that's gift cards, whether that's something, and just be able to get people out there.
Yeah, I'll just add, community level work means that you don't own your weekends. Right, that's when people are going to be able to connect with you. So you have to be willing to forfeit your Saturdays and Sundays so you can get out there and connect with the community.
Yeah, certainly. For the second question, I would like to start off with Charlotte. And again, you've worked beyond, not just with the state of Connecticut, with others, but where would you say, as a community, region, state, country, that we have failed when addressing environmental justice, and what can be learned from these shortcomings?
So for the past 4 decades, EPA has been incorporating environmental justice into its Superfund work, but it's only been in recent years that we've actually been incorporating it into our greater policies and also into our other programs as well. Part of that is because of the current administration. Our regional administrator sees the importance of environmental justice, so that's why we are now starting to incorporate it. Some things that we have learned by not incorporating it is that it has to be, because it's not just in a vacuum. What we do at EPA, it's not just affecting one community and one environment, it's affecting so many other aspects of a community as well. I think we've all seen that across the different panelists, whether we're talking about the public transit or we're talking about housing. They're all interconnected with each other. And so this work that we are doing, we see that we really need to make sure that we are acknowledging the interconnection of it, and that's where we can do better.
Yeah, definitely. And Jason, as a follow-up to that, I know in your master's work, everyone here hasn't had the opportunity to talk to you as well as we did, and you really have a wealth of just experience in different environmental justice issues that you've tackled. Can you speak a little bit to your experience in terms of things that you've done not only in the state but beyond the state, and what has been, you know, shortfalls or successes?
Absolutely. I think even going back to the original question, I'll come back to that.
That's okay.
And going to the EPA definition of environmental justice, I think, you know, it's a start of something, but I think the word regardless of race still, or regardless of economic income, still doesn't sit well with me, only because I think you have to be able to understand all those complexities in the way that they contribute to the way people are experiencing daily life in their environments. So I think that's something I definitely want to consider as we're moving forward. But some of the work that I've done some food access work in my hometown in New Jersey, which I started as a youth in a program that I was a high school student. They brought me in as an intern, and I learned about food insecurity, food access, and that was sort of my first level of understanding sort of environmental issues. You know, growing up, I think I grew up in an environmental justice community, was classified as an environmental justice community now, and you would always hear the conversations of, you know, don't drink the water at school, like don't drink from the water fountain. You would hear the conversations of like, okay, like when the streetlights come on, you come inside. And when it's hot outside, you don't put the AC on, you put a wet rag on your neck. Like there was so many intricacies that even as a youth, I didn't necessarily have the depth of understanding those environmental challenges, but I had the breadth of understanding exactly what was going on in my communities. So even as we're engaging in communities that institutionally might not have the entire depth of understanding all the decision-making processes that led to the life that they're experiencing, it's about understanding and giving them the respect that they have the breadth and they know what's going on, and that community knowledge in and of itself is sometimes way more valuable than what goes on at the table.
Yeah, certainly, definitely. And Brent, want to allow you to touch upon this question if you'd like before we move on to the third question.
Certainly, I concur. I think that, you know, through people's lived experiences, they understand the contrast, right? So New Haven is, they call it a $10 city, meaning you could take a $10 taxi from one end to the other and cover the entire city. And, you know, so people, there is an issue of proximity, but it's not that big of an issue to the point where you're unaware of how other neighborhoods like East Rock or Westville are in contrast to Dixwell, New Hallville, or the Hill. And I think people get that. They may not have the vocabulary, they may not be familiar with the nomenclature of certain things. Instinctively, they know that things are not right with their neighborhood, whether it mean the number of green spaces in their community or issues like lead paint, because a lot of the industrial areas are also areas where many of the residents of color in New Haven tend to live. But I would also say that when it comes to environmental justice issues, connecting to Jason's point is that, and also to your point as well, is that it's at the macro level. So oftentimes when young people or people of color hear or receive promulgations about environmental justice issue, it's at a global, it's at a macro level. We're talking about the oceans, we're talking about, you know, the ice caps melting, things of that nature, temperatures rising, but we're not talking about where the Long Island Sound will be relative to the I-95 in 20 years. We're not talking about urban planning and designs and how you can engage your older person or your mayor even, or an elected official at the state level or even the congressional level, and to be able to engage in discourse about how you can contribute towards policy change that will directly impact your neighborhood. And so that's pretty much what I would add to that.
Great, thank you. So for the third question, I would like to start off with Jason once more. You know, we often talk about listening sessions. We want to hear from the community. We're going to start off and have these listening sessions or gather this feedback. But, you know, community engagement is only effective if we turn the information that we receive into action or incorporate it in some way. What's at stake for decision makers if we fail to reach all demographics and meaningfully incorporate their input?
Absolutely. I think I'll try to answer this in a couple different buckets. I think from sort of a community organization or community-based organization standpoint, what's at risk from the operations side is funding. Being able to acquire funding to be able to support community initiatives that are doing a lot of the brunt work for environmental justice communities can be impacted if state-level decision makers or if any decision makers are not taking that into account. I would also add that some of the work that I do on Puerto Rican resettlement here in New Haven, a big piece that might be missing without fully incorporating this are the future residents of New Haven. In 2017, Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, and there was this big influx of Puerto Ricans moving to Connecticut all throughout the state. And that trend has stayed true through a lot of other natural disasters and hazards that have happened in Puerto Rico and throughout the Caribbean. So thinking about how Connecticut's position of this sort of decision maker and stakeholder engagement can leave space to consider people who think of Connecticut as a haven or a hub for safety or a new opportunity or of just a place to be that when my home is destroyed, I can now go to Connecticut. So not only do we have to consider the residents who are currently in Connecticut, but also considering Connecticut in that future way as well, of being able to house and being able to support those who are going to view it as a home in the future.
Yeah, definitely. And I know I asked this question almost on behalf of some of the people in the audience that, and I'll pitch it to you, Charlotte, as a follow-up. A lot of times it's hard to engage with people, or, you know, there may be a gap in terms of communicating with, if we're on a government level, communicating with residents and vice versa. And in your role, you know, you kind of act as that liaison. Can you speak to maybe what are some best practices or things that you've seen along the way that helps bridge that communication, as we said earlier, that two-way communication between those different stakeholders or parties?
Yeah. So sometimes the federal government is not always looked as favorably. We're coming in, we're here to help. What does this mean? And I think it's honestly showing up and listening to what people have to say. And it's actively listening. So it's not just showing up, nodding my head saying, okay, I hear you. These are the issues that you have. Great. And I leave and I don't come back. It's about me showing up in the community, and I'm going to be listening to the various stakeholders. So we often start with the mayor, the town manager's office, and hear their perspective and what community groups they work with. We often work with groups like Brent's, but we also work with researchers as well to hear what is happening in these communities. What do you recommend before we even step foot and we are going to be culturally sensitive of the community there? And so sometimes we also bring community members together, so various stakeholders, and we make sure that they're all represented at the table. Something that we work on in the agency is we have community involvement plans. So laying out, and they're specific for each community, about what they can expect from us. So when are we going to be there? How are we going to be there? How often are you going to hear from us? And what you can hold us accountable for. And I think that's the biggest, one of the most important things is accountability. Making sure that we are held accountable when it comes to community engagement and what we are going to be committing to.
Yeah, I love that, accountability. I think that's a strong and powerful word for all of us to take away from today's conversation. And then Brent, also as a follow-up to this question, I know that you've had a lot of experiences working with the youth, and that's something also that you talked about a little bit earlier. And in our work, it could be challenging. We talk about reaching all demographics, and youth is sometimes forgotten or not thought about, or people think it's complicated to try and impose and reach them. So what advice do you have for the audience members who may be struggling to try and reach and engage the youth?
Be patient. Sometimes I think we take for granted our experience, and life is long, but it feels short. And I think sometimes that carries over into how we comport with young people. The reality is that they're very astute. And if you take the time to connect with them and to just listen and listen critically, you will learn a lot from them. The younger generation, or generations younger than mine, I should say. I don't have a lot of grays, but not that old. But they actually just look at the world slightly differently. And I would say that they're a little bit more connected and spend a lot of time in the nuances, and we sort of gloss over things, and we can kind of be caught up in our own dogmas. But if you just take the time to listen, you'll learn a lot. The other thing is building trust. And so when you're a trusted and credible messenger, advocate, and also someone who helps to sort of have a equitable distribution of the agency that you have, right? It's going back to the point of who's at the table and why they're not at the table. So you have to be able to open those doors, right? And so that means working with youth, working with families, and connecting them not only within their community to things that are meaningful to them. So for example, we bring families out to our farms and we teach them as a family how to grow their own food, and then we encourage them to participate in a community garden where they can grow pretty much as long as they want to maintain their garden bed. There's no end to that. But it also means that you're going to be able to provide information. You're going to read the 500-plus page EPA document and distill that down into some actionable items and share that with communities in a way that's digestible to them, and then provide clear direction or even take direction and guidance from them on what should be the next action step. And working in schools, I found that, and I think that the advent of COVID spurred a lot of this, but I think some of this stuff predates COVID. I found that a lot of public schools are enthusiastic and have a strong appetite for learning outside of the classroom. They seem to have a strong appetite for more enrichment opportunities, nature-based opportunities to complement STEM education, the demand for STEM education. And so I think when kids feel like they're being bogged down with learning because educators have to perform well, they're being highly judged and assessed by the powers that be, I think that pressure trickles down to the students and they feel that in a real way. And regardless of curricular reforms and different iterations of curriculums, nothing beats having fun, spending time outdoors, and learning through experience.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And I think that's a great segue to question 4, which is, a little bit broader, and want to open the floor for either of you to open up and start. But would certainly like to know, what are some of the misconceptions about environmental justice that you would like to dispel on this stage?
I'll start.
Okay.
I think a misconception is what an environmental justice community looks like. I think there's often a stereotype that it's going to be an urban community, and that's not true. I work with a lot of rural communities and suburban communities that would be considered environmental justice. And I think in addition to that, it's taking a deeper look at the community. So it's not just looking at a town or a city as a whole and checking the box and saying, well, I looked at the demographics, we should be all set. It's getting your feet on the ground and looking. So I'm actually working on a site up in Maine right now, and according to everything, this is not an EJ community. This community is prosperous, there's a lot of people involved, and it doesn't seem like there's any EJ. Once I'm on the site and I'm looking across the street, I'm like, hold on, wait a second. We have people that are speaking other languages. There's also some public housing right down the road in addition to senior housing. And so then it's not only looking at sometimes the census data that's there, but getting your feet on the ground and getting to know the community and understanding that it's not just one look to environmental justice. There's a broad range of what environmental justice looks like and can be.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great point because you also have sites in our region that aren't, the Waterburys, the Bristows, the Ansonias, the Derbys, the major cities that we think about. There are other communities that are rural, suburban, that also can be, impacted by this.
Yes, true. Yeah, there's a lot of communities that maybe on paper you wouldn't really realize that they're environmental justice, but they are, and you have to look at them and look deeper and just not what's on the surface. And at EPA, we work with a range of communities, whether I'm in Beacon Falls or I'm in New Britain, I'm in Waterbury, we are all over the state, ready to help where we can.
Definitely. And Jason, I seen you start to say something. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No worries. I think one common misconception that I want to dispel is that environmental justice is a goal. Environmental justice is a framework to which we achieve the goals of dispelling a lot of systemic inequities and systemic oppression. And I don't know how many of us all are familiar here, but there are actually 17 core environmental justice principles that were outlined back in the 90s by the environmental justice movement leaders. That if you're working on a project and you think it's environmental justice, run it through those principles. If you're working on developing community engagement, look at those principles. And if you just want to look them up on Google, it's probably going to be the first link that you come up if you look up environmental justice principles. Going back to the whole theme of the entire conversation, and Charlotte, you spoke about this as well, that environmental justice work just does not exist in silos. It is sort of that lens and that foundation that we can view everything that we want to achieve or everything that we want to work towards through. It can be about policing, it could be about bus routes, it can be about prison placement, school placement, public health, accessible healthcare. There's so many different ways that any problem that you're trying to dispel through your project or through the work that you do can be utilized or looked at through the Environmental Justice Foundation and principles to be able to then create the outcome that you're looking for.
Definitely. I think that is, again, another great nugget for the audience to take away is that environmental justice does not exist in silos. And that is such a powerful thing that, it's all intersectional and what one works on, we all work on. And that's why building those partnerships and collaboration between EP, the federal government, the local government, the state, the local communities, the CBOs, or community-based organizations, we're all working towards that same achievable goal. I think that's a very powerful message and very important to take away. Any other comments or that you would like to address to this question?
I think just going back to the last question, there tends to be this sense that, and I think it's just kind of how people in the EJ community typically show up, right? So we look like nature nerds and tree huggers. And so I think people sort of lose sight of how broad and how numerous the number of applications are involved in terms of disciplines and fields of thought, and that sort of create this sort of confluence that ties into environmental justice. And so one of the ways that we sort of try to connect with community to get them to sort of think about how it applies to their lives is to ask them a question, right? And that's, what can nature do? And what can you do for nature? And so by helping to encourage this sort of reflex to think about the environment, to think about nature and its application in your life, whether it means you live in an environment that's food insecure, whether it means you've been impacted by trauma, or you simply want to improve your dietary lifestyle because there's a history of diet-related disease in your family. And just really just encouraging them to start to think about nature and the environment in which they live in, connecting them to some of these social determinants of health, and then promoting the nature as a resource for them. And I think once they have an experience in which they can cultivate an affinity for the outdoors, for nature, that tends to sort of drive this sense of connection and ownership, and that this is something that we need to protect. Our environment, whether it's built or natural, needs to be managed, and there needs to be a sense of ownership and leadership that's community driven. And then I would say also is that a lot of times we're thinking about problems, right, that create this injustice within an environmental context, and then the solutions and how we approach solutions and how inclusive we are in getting to those solutions. But I would say that we don't tend to think like aspirationally. So when I talk with young people, specifically high school age kids, it's really more about imagining what could be and not necessarily even looking at problems. It's how would you redesign your neighborhood? How would you like to see a community garden have a broader application? Some of them are not even interested in growing food. They just want a place that's verdant that they can hang out in. All right, so how do you design that space so that's more accommodating for social connections? But I just think, you have to think out of the box. You have to meet people where they are and try to find things that they're curious and interested about, and connecting that to the environment and to nature, and just asking the question, what can nature do?
Yeah, thank you. I think that that's great. You said, with environmental justice and things of this nature, it's sometimes such a far off goal for us, or we can't see the end of the goal. And, to your point, like, you have to remain optimistic. You have to remain imaginative and open-minded. And I think that's how you figure out some of the solutions to these problems. And if you're not siloed, or if you're not in the box, and you're able to be open and think that the end goal can be a lot sooner, the end of the race can be a lot closer, then I think that definitely is something for us to take away and to keep in mind. But thank you so much for the comment. I think that was well thought out. I think that this may be a great time to segue to the audience Q&A.
So I think we have a question to start right here.
Thank you. Laura Francis from South Central Region, COG. Quite often now, when we're doing public outreach, we are met with distrust of government and some hostility. Can you give us some examples on how we can address that when we encounter such kind of reaction from whatever? And this hostility, I'm finding, is coming through almost any demographic. It could often come from the least likely group that you would think.
I'm assuming that one's for me. So one way that I have dealt with it in communities is still showing up no matter what and listening to people. A lot of times where those hostilities are coming from is fear, and fear of the unknown and what does this mean. So I always try to come ready to answer as many questions as I can. And also using various forms of communication. So not just holding a large public meeting that anyone can get up and kind of say what's on their mind, but instead having those smaller sessions where you can really get to know the people. I find that when you are able to individually name people in the community, there's less hostility, because often you know what Bob is going to say, you know what the issues are already, and you're able to kind of work it out in private and get to a point that it's going to be productive for you all. So I think showing up, holding some of those smaller meetings and getting to know your community has been really helpful for me in building the trust.
I would say, and I don't work for government now, but in a previous line of work, I was more connected to government. And I would say one of the things that has helped me is just being transparent and humble. I think sometimes we can come across as too polished, and I think that sort of drives more distrust. I'm quick to tell people what I don't know and what's beyond my pay grade, but I'm also quick to also share how diligent I will be to find a solution and incorporate them in the process, without making promises, right? And trying to accommodate any reservations that they have, and just being very clear and saying, well, this is where we are, this is where we can go, but it may be more arduous and slower than you might imagine. And I found that people tend to appreciate that and would be more willing to open up in the conversations that I've had.
Jason?
Sure, yeah. I would say that I think internally, in sort of, if you're encountering some hostility, some of that work is going back to the empathy piece that I mentioned before. Some of that is also just understanding your own positionality in that space, and being able to understand that you're in a place where you're working to sort of solve solutions that are people's everyday lives. So it's like that frustration can sometimes be warranted, that there have been broken promises, and that there have been failure from all avenues of government, private sector, maybe public sector. And so some of those hostilities are warranted in some of those capacities, and it's unfortunate that maybe you have to take that on in that situation, and you probably shouldn't. But I think just understanding that positionality and having that empathy can get you through that situation.
Great. We have another one back here. Thank you.
I'm Jim Byrne. I work for EPA Region 1 with Charlotte. I work in the Brownfields program, and literally probably 3/4 of my job is working in environmental justice communities. And one thing I don't really hear a whole lot about is environmental injustice and the impacts on handicapped folks and or mentally ill folks and stuff like that. And I was wondering how big a factor that is in your thoughts and your actions surrounding environmental justice.
Anyone care to field that one? I think it's you, Charlotte.
It's me? That's okay. I'll answer, Jim. Hi, Jim. So one way that, as Jim has brought up, is taking into account people that have various accessibility issues and understanding where they're coming from. So it's, again, as we keep saying over and over again, it's coming back and understanding your community and making sure that we know what the needs are and that we are going to meet them. A lot of times the town managers will often, or the mayors will know, hey, we do have this segment of the population and they are interested and they want to be engaged. Let's make sure that we're reaching out to them. But it's also going to come down to the materials that I'm producing in my job and saying, hey, maybe I need to change this from having so much writing to maybe infographics instead, or doing a video instead of just having it on print, and finding various unique ways that we can connect with people to make sure that everyone is aware of what's happening and is learning. I am more than happy to meet with people and go over something as many times as needed to make sure that someone is comfortable with the topic that we're focusing on. But I think you're right, Jim, is that it is often left out in the environmental justice conversation, and it should be brought in, and we should constantly be thinking about it. And I know when we are planning meetings as well, we're thinking about accessibility and can people get there? Is there access with public transportation? Are they actually able to get on the bus to get to the location that you're hosting it at? And so being aware of that. If we're hosting a public meeting, is it because of public safety? Do people have access? So thinking about all those issues is really important. I don't know.
I don't have much to add, but we do take into account some of those considerations. So because of the green spaces that we manage and some of the programs that we have towards youth, we do get organizations that will want to invite kids that have been impacted by trauma or have a mental health issue into our programs. And one of the things that we're very clear on is that we operate in a city. It's a small city, but it has big city problems. And so it is not exempt in any way from some of those realities. And so it could be a loud muffler, or it really could be a firearm being discharged. It could be a bunch of guys joking and ragging on each other, or it could be an argument that's going to escalate. There's all sorts of things going on in the city, from blight issues to noise pollution to heat island effect. And so we're just conscious of that and how we engage with certain populations. And we're very clear on what we can or cannot accommodate based upon our area of expertise and training or the limitations thereof.
Thank you, Brent.
Yeah, I'll share as well.
Sure, please.
I'm currently operating in a space of academia. I'm in a master's program, so a lot of what I do is reading and a lot of research papers and writing a lot of papers. But this conversation of how disability studies plays into environmental justice is very prominent in the environmental justice sort of scholar space right now. And it's obviously academia sort of responding to the work of frontline organizations that have been saying we have community members with accessibility issues. Why is there not research on how these environmental justice issues are plaguing a lot of these communities that we service. And I think a lot of times it comes down to sometimes in the work that people can be lazy and think that that doing extra work to make work accessible is extra work rather than it being the baseline of what we should be doing. And I think we just have to flip that mindset, like making sure that our people, that our community members with accessibility challenges, or even if we want to extend it to gender and sexuality, our trans community members, like how they're experiencing and operating in this space. You have to be able to understand that going down to that deep of a level of identity understanding in relation to the environment is not subtractive from anything that you're doing. It can only make the work that you're doing more inclusive. And if you lift up from the bottom up, then you're lifting up for all.
Thank you. Karen, do you have one back there?
I just thought I'd get out.
Right down front. I have
Okay.
someone right down here. Thank you.
My question is on the food deserts. I know that within the last 15 years, we've had a lot of problems in especially inner city areas where they've been overtaken, areas that have dollar shops and everything else, and all the other little grocers go out. Have there been any attempts to actually try to bring in fresh produce to those areas so that it isn't a food desert in that area any longer?
Sure. So one of the things that we share with folks who are connected to our organization is the importance of community resiliency. We tend not to use the term food desert. We'll say that a neighborhood might be food insecure or it's been impacted by food apartheid. So there's a lot of educated folks who are involved with urban planning and design and zoning, right? And so as developers move into a city like they are now in the city of New Haven, there's intentionality about where to place commercial areas or places where there's grocers who provide fresh organic food. Even some of the farmers markets that we see are located in more affluent areas of town. So what we encourage and what we do is put people in position to grow their own food, because there is no economic market to disrupt in that sense, right? Because there are no fresh food grocers in their neighborhoods, most of them. And so by putting people in position to grow their own food at our community gardens, there's over 50 of them that we manage. We also have 3 small-scale farms as well. We connect them to that reality. And in many ways, it's actually even more impactful because they're seeing food not on the store shelf, but they're seeing it come out of the ground. And they're able to identify it. And if people are growing their own food, they tend to want to incorporate those same foods into their diet, right? Because they're caretakers of the plants that they're growing. And they take a great deal of pride in it as well. And you'd be surprised. I grew up in a big city. So my first time living in a home was when I moved to Connecticut many years ago. And I had a lawn. And so I learned about the whole lawn and gardening community. And I didn't realize how intense that subculture was. But we see that played out in our community gardens where people take it very seriously. It is a passion. It is something that people brag and boast about. Everyone wants to talk about how great their tomatillos are or who's growing the best collards or okra. And if you can cultivate that enthusiasm across neighborhoods while working with them on a policy level so that they can get those grocers in their neighborhoods, I think you can create some synergy, but you also have to think about affordability. So at our farm stand, candidly, it's a loss leader in nonprofit terms because we sell our produce below market rate. So even if you don't have food assistance benefits, you're pretty much paying the same amount for produce that we grow at our farms, which we have a commitment to our community, so it's organically and sustainably done. We don't make money off of it given what we put into it, but it's affordable and accessible to everyone in the neighborhood. And if we can expand upon that, perhaps we can have a broader impact.
That's great.
Actually, Karen, to the Waterbury example, I would really point to Brass City Harvest.
Yes.
The food hub there is something that we've all partnered on. I know nothing about the wholesale retail of it, but I can tell you that we partnered with the city, with the Waterbury Development Corp, with Brass City Harvest. We took down an old factory. It is literally in the neighborhood, within residential properties. We cleaned up the site. We got rid of the environmental contamination there. That was kind of the end of our role as the COG. But from there, they've hired people from the neighborhood who work in there, who cook there, who clean and package the food, and they sell it as well locally in the neighborhood. I think that's one of the best models I've seen anywhere to bring fresh food into the neighborhood.
That's great, because I know from years ago, like 5 years ago, meeting with other folks, that it was very difficult because a lot of the people that were on programs were giving food vouchers, but they had no transportation to get there. So that was kind of where I was going.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have another on this side? Yes? No? Please.
Hi, my name's CJ May. I work for the city of Waterbury, and I think I know what your answer is going to be, but I'll ask it anyway because I think your advice will be good to hear again. One of the challenges that I think we faced in Waterbury is that much of the neighborhoods were designed to put factory spaces next to residential spaces, which made great sense during the first industrial revolution. People could walk down their stairs and they could walk 2 blocks and go to the factory. But now as we try to bring back many of the brownfields with new industry, even if they're clean industries, there's a lot of concerns by the folks, very valuable concern in the neighborhoods, that now there's going to be all this truck traffic and there's going to be factories, and there's concerns that this reindustrialization will be bringing big dirty trucks past their houses and perhaps past their schools. I can imagine from what you've already said this afternoon, engage the neighborhoods, talk to them, try to figure out what plans can be put into place to perhaps bring those businesses or choose businesses in those brownfields that better suit the comfort level of the neighborhood. But still, I would very much like to hear the panelists talk about that issue, because this intertwining was beneficial, and maybe if we are smart about it, we can make it beneficial again, because right now it's something of a stumbling block, because the residential and the industrial sectors are interwoven, but they often clash.
Who wants it? Who wants to take this one? Jason, you're on this?
Yeah, I guess I can start us off. I think a big part of this is also a question for like the just transition, as we're beginning to shift away from these larger factories that have been using fossil fuels and maybe want to transition to clean energy, or as we're transitioning old manufacturing places to now create solar panels. There's a whole system of being able to provide opportunity for people in these communities to be able to be engaged not only in that employment process, but also in the design of how they want to build their community. So I don't think I have the answer specifically to how do we sort of navigate the, let's say, the diesel emissions from the trucks that are then going to be transporting the goods that are made at the factory that may employ people in the community. I'm not on that level of sort of city planning, but I think looking at some of the just transition principles and thinking about ways to get people involved in that process, and making it as local as possible, maybe even thinking about off-peak times for transportation. If you know that there's a time when people are working or if the kids are at school, then you might use certain routes versus other routes, and just trying to keep those emissions try to keep those emissions as far away as possible during the times that people are not there might be a possible option for something like that.
Yeah, I would say, so there's a very active and committed group of stakeholders who reached directly out to me and my organization and others who are in the environmental justice community, and particularly my organization because we're also a land trust. And they look to us to acquire more land, both from public land and also private land, as a way to hedge against development, commercial or residential in the area. And so we don't like to play the political game, although our work is inherently political in many ways, and we understand it. But the challenge is when you have competing policy issues, right? So in New Haven, there's a significant affordable housing crisis, and we have Yale. And so property taxes and all that stuff is in a bit of a disarray. And it's not where I think the city would like to see it from a revenue standpoint. And so the economic base that is not as mobile as others, tend to rent. They're not homeowners. And so there's a strong encouragement for development for pretty expensive rental fees, and things like that. And so you see this sort of migration of a different population. And with that comes businesses and the redesign of neighborhoods, gentrification. And so a lot of the residents turn to us to acquire vacant lots, have them remediated and transformed into community gardens. And I think one of the challenges is that it's a slow process. We just can't turn it on like that, And I think sometimes there's a bit of frustration, and we ensure them that there is actually a procedure a process you have to go through in partnership with the city. But then there's also making sure that it's healthy to grow food there. So we have to test the soil. We have to make sure that there's proper remediation practices in place and things of that nature. But sometimes we're sort of pinned between these sort of competing interests, and you tend to get people who are like, well, this plot of land, they'll actually pull out a GIS map and say, could you acquire all these properties? And, we're a small organization. We like to think we punch above our weight, but it is a serious dynamic. And I think that as we start to look at the prosperity of the city and the different communities that are involved in shaping what that looks like, we'll continue to see these contrasts and interests play out. Our thing is that we want to have as many green spaces in neighborhoods that have been limited in their access or the invitations extended to them to access these green spaces as much as possible. And so that's the business that we're in, and we'll continue to go down that road until we can't.
Okay. Well, it's been a long day, folks. I know it's not quite rush hour yet, but I don't think we have any more questions. So how about a big round of applause for our panel and for Desiree Blanchard, our moderator. Thank you all. I'm going to ask you all to just sort of sit for a second while together we just want to thank all of you for being here today on behalf of our board, our staff, our participants, our sponsors at Eversource and at Avangrid. So important. We couldn't be in this building without the two of them. So our gratitude from all of us to all of you for your attendance, participation. If you want, there's a email address, contact us at mvcogct.gov. Contact us, one word. Send us any other comments, any other questions you might have had today or might think about later, and staff will process those and try and get back to you with the answers. But thank you all. Get out of here and be safe. Take care.